What's up, guys? Welcome to episode number 1 of the Awoke podcast. My name is Albert, and
My name is David.
we decided to make this podcast as a discussion and topic-based place where we'll be talking about topics like remote work. We'll be talking about topics like traveling the world. Ultimately, topics that are related to escaping the 9 to 5 grind, the matrix, the main reasons why we decided to move away from the countries that we came from, and ultimately moving to location freedom, independence, so on and so forth. So we're really excited to get this going, and um, that's really what the main driving focus is here. So
All right, guys, so I'll take it from here. So basically, what noticed, what we've seen, both Albert and I grew up in the U.S. We grew up about a 5 minute walk away from each other in Everett, Washington. The place that we come from is filled with drug addicts, alcoholics. I mean, it's just a place where dreams go to die. So we noticed that a long time ago, and we both left Everett, Washington. I left Everett, Washington, I mean, going on about 4 or 5 years now. Albert more recently. But we realized that escaping the Puget Sound area, essentially the second most depressing place in the country, being Seattle, Washington, we realized that that is not going that um, you have to get a lot further away from that than just a state or two, or maybe even 3 or 4 states away. You really have to get across the world to get away from that overall depression, that overall lifestyle that is designed to be a trap, right? Everyone that I look back towards, back in my hometown, I mean, every single time I come to visit, it seems like nobody's moving anywhere. Nobody's moving in any direction. There's very few that I know that are making moves. So where are we right now? We are in Playa del Carmen, Mexico, and we're going to break down what we noticed between countries, right? So between states and between countries, right? So the differences between Everett, Washington to other states that we have lived in or visited, and just comparing all those, the differences between all those to other countries, such as Mexico, such as Colombia. So this year so far, 2023, we've already spent more than a month in Colombia, and this is our first week here in Mexico this year. So we're going to break down the differences between all of these. We're here currently on a rooftop in Playa del Carmen, so you might hear some noise in the background. But yeah, Albert, what do you have to say about that whole subject?
yeah, so I don't know about you, but for me personally, moving away from the U.S. and moving to these type of countries was almost like this deeper calling, and it was almost like either I move out and I find um, a different path in one of these countries like Mexico or Colombia, which was more recent on my list. But just going to Mexico, I really started this whole path of remote work, traveling, living abroad about 3 years ago now. And ever since I really stepped foot into this country, it just opens my mind and opened my eyes to a completely different possibility of being able to be in a place that not only was my inspiration different, but just my overall creativity, my drive, my focus changed. And it's almost as if this Western conditioning that we live in the United States specifically, it's just designed so much so to be in this systemized mentality where I didn't have much freedom, um, which is ironic, right? It's the country of freedom, but it feels like the one country where you're trapped and locked into a box. And so just being here, I've been able to just tap into this creativity and this potential, and I'm constantly in this frame of abundance. I'm constantly thinking of different businesses I can build, different opportunities I can have. Um, and so just the creativity and the abundance, those are really the two words that come to mind when really just stepping foot into this different environment and different mentality, at least for myself. Um, what would you say would be like sort of the driving factors for you to be on that first step, at least initially?
Yeah, so I mean, I visited Colombia for the first time about 4 years ago. That same year, I visited Ukraine as well, where I was born. And just overall, just seeing the difference in the lifestyle, right? Like you see a whole different level of opportunity, you see a whole different level of work ethic, right? You go to the US, you got these people that work their 9 to 5. They work from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. and they act as if they just, gave all their effort. Yeah, I come to these countries and I see people that work from 5 a.m. till 9 p.m., right? The opposite schedule, except with obviously a lot more hours. And yeah, I mean, they have something to complain about, right? Like they have like a job that barely pays anything. We meet people that make $5 a day, if that, right? So these people grind from 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. and then we go back to the U.S. and we see these people that complain about their 9 to 5, right? They barely put in any effort during that week. They barely put any effort during that day, and they have a whole lot to complain about, right? Being around those kinds of people, you're always going to be you're going to be adopting their same exact mentality,
Right.
right? The mentality
Right.
of the weakness, right? So just overall, just leaving all that weakness behind and the complaints that the woke carry, right? You just see a whole different perspective. You see a whole different perspective on life. Um, the other thing too is more sunshine, right?
Yeah.
If you're here in South America, you're going to get a whole lot more sunshine than you are in the U.S., right? Last week we were in Charlotte, North Carolina, thinking that that place should have a good amount of sunshine, right? No, we were depressed. Why? Because it's always cloudy and the weather's just all kinds of weird, right? In Washington, I'm pretty sure that in Washington State, where we come from, it's still the wintertime there, right? They're still getting snow and all that. So, um,
Yeah, one thing I want to touch on too that got me thinking about how you were saying like people just people always complain about where they're from, their location, and that's one of those things that I've noticed the most as I started traveling is it's not that the area somebody lives in is the ultimate issue. When I started traveling, I realized that the environment that you grow up in, the conditioning that you have, the sort of incubator that you're put into is ultimately where you find every reason to either dislike your situation, dislike your path in your life, so on and so forth. And it's almost one of these things where, yeah, the same way you said, there's people here really really hustling. Like if you talk about what the struggles of the U.S. life compared to some of these countries that we visited, it's so minuscule. It's such a minuscule thing, and yet we're one of the most depressed countries, and we have the highest pharmaceutical rates with people being depressed and needing to be on antidepressants and therapy every single day. And you take a look at these other countries, and you're like, wow, they're really going through some struggles.
mhm.
And so it opens up this sort of perspective of the sort of environment and the sort of conditioning that you grew up in is ultimately a reflection of what was already instilled to you from a very young age, right? It's the problems that you think you have, and they're not really your problems. They're more so the problems of your surroundings. And so the more I've traveled, and the more I've gone to these different places, the more that I realized that it's it's all subjective to the area that you're in. The problems that you have aren't really your problems. And when you start traveling, you start experiencing these sort of different places, then you realize that these aren't my problems. These are ultimately conditioning that I had just because I grew up in this area, just because I spoke this language, just because I ate this food. Literally every single thing that you can think of from birth, this is all conditioning that you had. And once you start traveling, you start seeing these different realizations of this is conditioning that was instilled into me, then you start thinking, well, if this isn't me and if these aren't my thoughts, then what ultimately, who am I ultimately? And you start going down this rabbit hole of self-discovery, self-exploration. You start finding these different things about yourself, and I believe this is ultimately the way to level up and reach self-actualization and your ultimate potential is because you start seeing how silly these limitations you put onto yourself ultimately are, right? And so you find different ways to be able to label those and identify those sort of beliefs that you have, and you start opening yourself up to a completely different reality from that point on.
Yeah, I think the U.S. has the most people that carry the victim mentality out of any country that I've ever been to. I mean, I've been in places in these countries where People have every reason to complain about their situation, and yet you see kids playing with one, like 10 kids sharing one toy, and they're happier than any kid in the U.S. that has iPads and everything in hand, right? So um, that's the main thing, is like getting away from that whole kind of victim mindset surroundings is going to be a huge boost to your overall well-being, right? Now, let's transition to the subject of, what's the cost of living like in these places? What's the overall lifestyle like? What can you expect if you are coming from the US or from the UK or wherever you might be, as far as the Western world goes, right? What can you expect if you come to a country like this? Cost of living wise, it's going to be different across all parts of South America. I mean, Albert can definitely explain how the cost of living was here about a year or two ago compared to what it is like now. Colombia, overall, Colombia is just a great place as far as cost of living goes. And it's not only cost of living, right? It's the lifestyle that you can have there. It's also just the people, too, right? People, the overall population is just a much more happier population, right? And we could definitely get into the subject of women as well. I mean, that's a great. Well, that's just, overall, Colombia is just a country that's on the list of some of the most beautiful women in the world, and not just the most beautiful physically, attraction wise, but everything else, as far as the way that they're raised, right? We could talk about the women in the U.S. and how untraditional their ways are, right? I mean, I could just explain examples of, just example on example of how backwards the mentality is of the women in the U.S., right? I mean, we could explain just in general the
Yeah.
character and the attitude that sixes and sevens carry in the U.S. compared to compared
Yeah,
to
yeah.
the
And one of those things is that it's almost like, with the current conditioning that we experience in the Western world, as a male especially, it's almost as if you feel guilty for being in your masculine frame. Things that otherwise, you look back hundreds of years ago, all our ancestors, the way they lived, the way they carried these different traits of, this is what a man should be, this is what a woman should be, maybe not even should be, but ultimately can be, and the ultimate potential. It's so different, to the point where if you tap into that like deeper desire of ultimately developing yourself as a man, you almost feel guilty, and you're kind of like, why is everybody going against me? Why is why do
Are
I
you
have
being
this?
called toxic masculinity and
Yeah,
all this? Yeah.
toxic masculinity, all of this. And when you go to these different countries, and this poison, in my opinion, hasn't dripped and leaked into these sort of areas, and you start seeing people, men being very masculine, women being very feminine, you start to almost feel like, wow, like these sort of things that I've believed that I should be and how I should ultimately become, this almost intuitive guidance that you've had that has been pushed as wrong, and you should be guilty and shameful for this. When you realize that, like, wow, there's people in this world who really embrace those attributes about themselves, then it kind of gives you this different liberation and almost this like sense of freedom of, I can be whoever the fuck I want to be. I can be a man tapped into my potential, and be that person that's driven, motivated, being able to provide for the family, for the tribe, being able to build brotherhoods, being able to have this mindset where ultimately we are here as men on this earth to be able to be providers and to be builders and to be leaders, and women are here to be supplemental to that. There's a beautiful dynamic that is created when those two polar opposites meet and they synchronize. And you see a lot of these relationships. I mean, you look at the U.S., like, it's the highest divorce rates possible. Like, especially like lower income communities in the U.S. I think, I don't know statistically what it is, but I want to say it's like 60, 70% divorce rates, or single moms everywhere. And you wonder why and how did this ultimately happen? And it's because the dynamics have just been so skewed. There's no polarity, and without polarity, you just find yourself in this constant cycle of both people not being satisfied in a relationship. And when you see that, in other parts of the world, this hasn't been conditioned in this way yet. Is getting there ultimately, but you start to see, okay, maybe since there is hope, there is potential to be able to guide yourself in this way, then um, it kind of gives you this new developed strength in a way where you find yourself in this position where, yeah, I can be in that frame and I can be in that mindset. And if somebody in the Western world tells me otherwise, then I don't give a shit, quite frankly. So
So yeah, so that's exactly what the rest of the podcasts are going to entail, right? Is those kinds of subjects. So we're going to be breaking it down raw. We're going to be breaking it down to the extreme. We're not going to be holding anything back. And yeah, if you're woke, you're going to be pissed. So don't watch the show. Well, all right then. We'll call that the first podcast. We'll call it a night there, and the next podcast we'll be breaking down one of those subjects to the extreme. All right, guys. Have a good night.